The A7C II is a super powerful camera with a 33 megapixel sensor and the ability to film up to 60 frames per second in 4K. Now this camera is tiny and there's a lot built into it, but is this a good camera to get or not? Well, in this video, I want to talk about the pros and the cons with this camera and also discuss the new 16 to 35 f2.8 because I had the opportunity to work with this camera lens combo while I shot a documentary in Rwanda. So instead of just taking this camera and the lens out in my backyard and shooting some shots and giving you some thoughts, I actually used this combo to film a full documentary. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about the different things that I liked about this setup and some of the things that I don't like about the setup. But first, let me just give you a little background on why I was in Rwanda filming a documentary. So I work with a nonprofit called Sony, and Sony pairs filmmakers with nonprofits that need a film made but don't have the budget to be able to hire these filmmakers. And so as a creator, we donate our time and Sony pays for all the expenses to work with one of these nonprofits and create a film for them. And this project in Rwanda was unique because not only were we making a film for a nonprofit, but we also brought along 5 aspiring filmmakers with us, and I shot a behind-the-scenes documentary around the journey of these 5 college-age students who have never left the country and documented their experience on their first international trip as they learn filmmaking in the process of making a film for this organization. So there's a lot of layers to what's going on with this project. However, I brought along the A7C II to film everything, and I used the 16 to 35 f2.8 to film the majority of these projects. And if you're a creator who wants to work on one of these nonprofit films, we'll include a link down below in the description to where you can find out more information about Sony and the work that they do to pair creators with these nonprofits. However, let's talk about the A7C II. And let me just give you a quick rundown of what this camera has built in. So it has a 33 megapixel back illuminated sensor with a dedicated AI processing unit, which allows for better autofocus and some features like auto reframing. It has AI-based real-time tracking with 94% of the image area covered for autofocus. It shoots 4K using the oversampled 7K sensor, and it could shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second and HD up to 120 frames per second. It's got S-Cinetone and S-Log, so it compare with any other Sony camera in terms of the look. It has things like breathing compensation and focus map. It's got in-camera time-lapse creation, and it has Sony's newer design with stills, video, and S&Q mode right on the camera body. And so overall, it's got a lot of really good specs in this camera, but essentially what it is an A7 IV in a smaller form factor. And it's got a few limitations with the smaller form factor. However, the small size makes it perfect for YouTube or travel or anytime you just want a smaller camera. Now, one of the big things for me is that I work with the ZV-E1, and the A7C II actually redesigned the grip so it's a lot easier to hold. And there's also this new extension that goes on the bottom of the camera that allows for the camera to be a little bit taller if you do want to have your pinky on the camera. When I'm working with these size cameras, the A7C II or the ZV-E1, your pinky hangs off. However, this little extension piece of plastic fixes that problem. I didn't have the extension when I was out shooting. I just shot with the camera as is, and even with it, the small form factor and small body, it is easy to hold and it's easy to use. Now this camera is a perfect hybrid camera because of that 33 megapixel sensor. So it's good for both photo and video, and it does have a small EVF in the upper left-hand corner. So when you hold it up to your face, it does sit over to the side, which is great if you want to be able to use your other eye to kind of see what's going on around. Now the EVF is definitely smaller than something you'll find on the A7 IV or one of the other bigger cameras. However, it is usable in super bright light. When I was in Rwanda, it was bright sunlight pretty much everywhere we went, and I had the camera up to my face using that little EVF just so I could see my exposure and be able to see the shot without having to always just rely on the screen. Now, I'm mainly a video shooter, so I'm mostly gonna be talking about the video features in this camera. And so when it comes to the 4K, when you're shooting at 24 or 30 frames per second, it's oversampling from the 7K sensor. So the footage does look really crisp. Now, when you bump it up to 4K 60, it punches in 1.5 times. So you never have the full width of the sensor when you're shooting 4K 60. It's always gonna have a 1.5 times crop, so a Super 35 crop. However, you're getting full 4K resolution out of that crop. So when you're using something like the ZVE1 or the FX3, to be able to get that kind of a crop, you're using clear image zoom. But on the A7CII with that higher megapixel sensor, you get a full 4K image when you do punch in. Now, at times this 4K 60 punch in is frustrating, especially when you want to use the wider end of your lens. However, other times it's super useful. So when I'm shooting with the 16-35, that lens becomes a 16-50. And I just set one of the buttons on the back of the camera to do an auto punch in to the Super 35 mode so that I have access to it quick when I'm out filming. And oftentimes when I was using the 16-35, I would be on the end at the 35mm and be able to go closer to a 50. So I had more range with this one lens because of this ability to be able to punch in and out. When you are shooting at the wider end and you want to shoot 60 frames per second, well, you're always going to have that 1.5 crop. So you never get the full width of the sensor when you want to shoot at 60 frames per second. When I was out shooting this project, it never really bothered me having this crop in 60 frames per second. It's one thing when you're testing, it might feel like an issue, but when I was actually out filming and in a real world setting, like actually shooting a documentary, it wasn't that big of a deal to have this crop at 60 frames per second. And a lot of the times when I'm shooting slow motion for these kinds of projects, I'm only using 60. So I don't need to have 4K 120 frames per second to be able to shoot one of these projects. However, if you do want to use 120 frames per second, this camera bumps it down to HD. So you do have access to 120, but it's just in HD, you don't have access to 4K. For color in this camera, when you're shooting video, you have access to S-Cinetone or S-Log3. Now, both of these are great options. The S-Cinetone is Sony's professional level of color that basically gives you a good look out of camera. Now, S-Log3 is perfect when you want to do some color grading, and you pair that with the 10-bit 422 footage that you get when filming in 4K, and you could do some powerful color grades. So all of this footage that you've been seeing in this video, I've been grading with a LUT that I built specifically for Rwanda. And if you want to use this LUT in your own videos or any of my other adventure LUTs, then I'll include a link down below in the description to all of the LUTs that I've created for S-Log3. But these LUTs also work on any camera that you work with. There's two variations in my set of LUTs. One of them is for any camera, so it's just a creative look that you can apply to any Rec 709 footage. And then I've also tailored each one of these looks specifically for S-Log3 so that when you put it onto your S-Log3 footage, you have an instant grade without having to do a ton of extra work to be able to get your footage looking right. So after this video, make sure you head in the description to check out a link to those LUTs. Now, in terms of stabilization, you have 7 stops of compensation. So it is a little bit more than other Sony cameras, and it's not as smooth as, say, a gimbal. However, there were times where I was doing 20-30 minute interviews and I was hand holding the camera and the footage is super still. I was able to do little moves left and right, and I was able to get this really smooth footage without a lot of jitters. So most of the time I was either shooting handheld or I had it on a gimbal. And when I was shooting it handheld, I didn't really have to worry about micro jitters or little bumps here and there because the camera was able to compensate for a lot of those movements. Now, it's not gonna be perfect. If you're running or you're moving quickly, you will see some bumps, but the 7 stops of compensation actually was very useful, especially with how light this camera is. And that's one thing that makes this camera so useful. It's actually 45% smaller and 20% lighter than the A7 IV. So it's significantly smaller than its bigger counterpart. And so for me, I was able to easily pack this into my backpack. And I also brought along my ZVE1 as a second body in case I needed some of the features that this camera has that the A7CII doesn't. And so the size is super useful and it makes the camera non-intrusive. It's one of Sony's smallest full frame mirrorless cameras and it just looks tiny. So when you're out filming, you don't have this big setup. You have a lot of power with this tiny little body. Now, when I'm shooting documentary and I'm using these small form factors, I'm not really building out these cameras. But if you are someone who wants to add attachments onto these cameras, that's where you might see some downsides to the smaller body size. So when you look at the ports, it just has a micro HDMI. So if you're connecting a monitor to this camera, you don't have a full-size HDMI to be able to have a strong connection. Now, it does have microphone in and headphone out, so you don't have to worry about any issues with audio. And if you're using something like the M1 microphone, you can use the hot shoe mount and it connects to all of Sony's accessories. Personally, I was using the Sony M1 on this documentary shoot, and then I had the DJI mic as my backup for wireless audio, but most of the time I was using this M1 microphone, which has all of these different polar pickup patterns, gives you a lot of flexibility when you're out shooting in a run and gun setting. Very rarely did I need to throw a wireless mic on someone. It was only for situations where someone was walking pretty far away from camera or we were doing a longer lens interview. Now the other thing with this small body size is there's only one card slot. So on the A7 IV, you have 2 card slots, and you could also use 2 different types of memory cards. In the A7CII, you only have an SD card slot and there's only one. So for professional work, this might be a deal breaker because there's definitely times where you want to have the dual functionality of the bigger cameras. And also you might want to use the CFast Express A cards, which are much faster, and you can get cards that go up to 1 terabyte. And so for some of you, that smaller body size might not be the best because of the 1 card slot and the ability to have an SD card. Now this camera comes with a dedicated AI processor, so it does have super fast autofocus. And that's one thing when working with this camera setup, is I never really had to worry about where my focus was in the shot. I could easily tap on the screen to focus to a specific thing, or I just let the camera decide, and most of the time, the camera was always stayed locked on to what I needed it to. And also when you're working with the autofocus, it can track different things like people, birds, insects, planes, trains, cars. It has this subject recognition built into the camera, so it makes it super easy to track whatever it is that you're following. And it has the ability to pick out a person even if they're turned away from a camera or they have something like a helmet on. It has an improvement of eye autofocus performance by 60%. So your camera will stay locked on to whatever it is that you're trying to capture. Now it has some of the other cool AI features like the auto reframing. However, when I was out shooting, really the AI processor was very helpful with autofocus performance, and that's the main thing that I used. I didn't really play with any of the other AI features. However, they are in this camera if that is something that you need when you're out filming. Now, the A7C II has a flip out screen. So if you're someone who makes YouTube content or you're filming yourself, it's easy. You flip the camera around, you can see yourself. It's just like all the other Sony cameras that are coming out. It makes it super useful for creators. Now, one of the big things that I've heard people talking about with the A7C II is overheating in this camera. Personally, I never had the camera overheat when I was out filming in Rwanda. Now I was working in about 80 to 90 degrees temperature, and the camera was on and off. Usually it's in my hand or it was up on my shoulder, and I'd have the screen flipped out from the camera when I was filming. And I was also shooting in direct sunlight a lot of the time. And the longest takes that I did on the camera when I was out filming was around 30 minutes in 4K 24 frames per second. So in this setting, when I was out filming this documentary, I had no overheating. I never even got a warning on the camera. However, with these smaller bodies, overheating does become a problem, and it is a problem on the ZVE1 when you're doing something like 4K 120 frames per second and letting it just roll for like 20 minutes. So the one thing you have to think about is, are you planning to use this camera for long durations at these higher resolutions and higher frame rates? That's just one of the limitations with these smaller form factor cameras, is they are more prone to overheat than the bigger counterparts. But if you're not going to be doing these long takes and just letting the camera run and run and run, then overheating's not going to become a problem. Like I said, I was using this camera and I never even saw a warning, and I was doing takes up to 30 minutes in heat that was pretty hot. However, it is something to definitely consider if this is a camera that you're interested in. Now let's talk about the 16-35 version 2. Now this lens is 20% lighter and 10% smaller. It still has the same size front element of 82 millimeters, but overall it does feel a little smaller than working with the version 1 of this lens. Now one of the big improvements with the 16-35 2.8 is now you have an aperture ring on the lens itself. And this is super useful because it can be clicked or declicked. And when you're shooting video, you can make adjustments with the aperture, and you're not gonna be seeing steps in your footage because you can declick it and make smooth rotation to change your aperture. Now, one of the big things that I noticed when working with this lens is the sharpness from corner to corner. So whether you're looking at the center of the image or in one of the corners, the lens looks super sharp. And one of the things with the older version is I noticed it wasn't as clean when it comes to the sharpness of the lens. And so overall, the quality of image that I've been getting out of this 16-35 is great. And a lot of times it looks so clean that I was using a diffusion filter in front of the lens to be able to give you some of those blooming highlights and not make it so perfect. And also when I'm shooting vlog style content, having that 16 just gives you a lot of range when you're filming yourself. Oftentimes I would zoom into a 20 because the 16 is so wide, but there is a great look out of that 16 to be able to get super wide shots when you're out filming. And when you pair it with the A7C II, you get that 1.5 times crop when you're using the APS-C mode, and you could get a 16-50. So this lens is a good combination with this camera to be able to give you a range and be able to have kind of a one lens solution for a lot of your video needs. So if you want to see more information about the A7C II or the 16-35 f2.8, I'll put links to both of them down below in the description. And if you want to see a behind the scenes breakdown of how we crafted a story when we're in Rwanda, well, I'm working on that video next, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notifications so you don't miss when I launch that video. And also, getting close to 1 million subscribers, so hit that subscribe button and let's hit that 1,000,000. And if you're someone who's interested in growing a YouTube channel, well, make sure you head over to thecreatorfilmschool.com. That's where I have my course on how you grow a YouTube channel, and also I have a bunch of other courses like editing, filming, storytelling. I'm also going to be building an entire course series around doing these nonprofit films for Sony. But next, you should check out this video right here, which goes through a ton of tips on how to shoot better outdoor and adventure style videos. I'll see you over there.